I got to say, I loved growing up in the 1970s. It was just an awesome time to be a kid. And I think part of the reason was, back then, people weren't so paranoid about liability or, sort of the unthinkable happening and your kid having some like grave injury. Back then, like, they didn't stop kids from being kids. The reality is we did get hurt every so often, but we survived. And I think there was a realization back then that, you can't avoid all risk to your kids. You can't put kids in a bubble. Like for me, I have to say, some of my best memories, the best times of my life, were in 8th grade in my junior high school metal shop class. Now, some of the machines that we were exposed to, I got to tell you, there's no way they would let kids anywhere near them today. There's no way. They were pretty unsafe. But we had just a great experience. But one that comes to mind is we had a metal forge. So what that is, it's basically a hearth, like a furnace, and it burns fuel and it interjects air to make it even hotter. So our project that we were making in the forge was a chisel. So we each got a little piece of band iron. It wasn't band iron. It was a rod. It was iron, and you take tongs. You put your iron in the forge. You get it glowing red hot, and then you take it and you pound out the front of it because you're taking the cylinder, and in the front you're going to sort of taper it down so you can actually use it as a chisel. Well, one of my best friends in the world growing up, my friend Brian, he was a friend from the neighborhood, and he and I just used to ride bikes all over Connecticut. It was awesome. But anyway, he was in my metal shop class. He put his iron in the forge, got it red, turned around, was very careless when he did, moving toward the anvil where you pound it out and whacked it right on my friend Michael's arm, the glowing red part. Michael's like screaming. Our teacher, our metal shop teacher, Mr. Lesovich, comes running over, and he was like immediately called, I think it was 911, and before we knew it, the ambulance was there, and they're taking Michael out. He wasn't on the stretcher, but they took him out, took him to the hospital. But anyway, that was major incident number one. But the next step in the process of making our chisels was, after you sort of pound it out, and you'd put it in I think it was like freezing cold water to kind of cool it off, and it kind of sets the strength of the metal in. Well, then it was I think the next day. The next step was to take the chisels and take the sort of the beveled, the tapered end, and grind it down into a point. I mean, it wasn't a single point. It was along the top edge of the chisel. So we used a grinding wheel, which is basically it's a spinning wheel with very very coarse material, and it would kind of spin toward you downward, and then there was like a little platform where you would put whatever it is you were grinding. In this case, it was the iron chisel, and you'd kind of shape it, so you do like the top half, let the grinding wheel go down against it, turn it over, and then do the other side of it, so that the top end of the chisel was like a very sharp point, which is what you wanted for a chisel. Well, again, it was Brian who did this. He had the idea that maybe his fingernails were a little too long, and maybe he can use the grinding wheel to file down his fingernails. So, but he was being very careful. He took his finger, put it on the platform, moved it very slowly toward the grinding wheel, just so that it would touch the nail and not the front of his fingertip. But what he didn't realize was, the grinding wheel coming toward you and down toward the platform, it's called an in-running nip point. So it kind of pulls in whatever is on the platform. And if it's metal, you hold it and you can resist that force that pulls it in. Well, not so much with the finger. So of course, Brian puts his finger in, somehow it catches, and it jams between the wheel and the front of the metal platform, and it basically took the nail bed off. And again, blood all over the place. Mr. Lesovich comes running over, calls the ambulance again, and this time they take Brian out. When I look back on those days, I got to say, part of what made it so fun was our teacher, Mr. Lesovich. He was just an awesome guy. We really loved him. He was probably 6'5", super strong, quiet, very reserved, real serious. He had these tinted aviator glasses. Kind of gave off a little bit almost like a Frankenstein type vibe. Not that he was, unattractive or scary looking. I think, he had the bangs, like Frankenstein. He was kind of just very, very serious, So, but he was a good guy, and we tortured him. And I look back, that poor guy, what we put him through. He always started the class. And by the way, so the way the metal shop was set up was a big open area with machines and processes everywhere. And in sort of the back right corner was Mr. Lesovich's office. And in front it had just a wall of glass so you could see in, and he had his desk there. And then in the back, sort of the opposite corner of the whole shop, there was like the classroom area. There's just some desks and like a screen for movies. And Mr. Lesovich would walk out, at the beginning of class, would walk out with his attendance book. He'd sit down, and he would just start going down the list. Johnson, Smith. You had to say here. Whatever. And inevitably, somebody would yell out some obscenity or some stupid joke, and Mr. Lesovich would just snap his book shut, and he'd just walk back to his office, and then he'd sit there, and he'd just kind of sit with his arms folded, like kind of like he was pouting. And that was like his way of telling us, like, okay, fine, you guys aren't going to work today. Good, you could just sit there. So then, we always appointed same kid, Wayne. He would walk over, and he would say, Mr. Lesovich, I don't know why we called him Mr. Lesovich. He would say, we're sorry, we're sorry, we'll be good. We promise we'll be good. So Mr. Lesovich wouldn't say anything. He would stand up with his tennis book, walk back, open it up, start going down the list again, and sometimes the same thing would happen again. Sometimes not. But again, I don't know. It was just like we took some pleasure in just driving this guy nuts. Like one thing we did back then, they had these. You could buy them in like knife stores. We used to call them kung fu stars. It was like the whole kung fu craze was happening then. So they were basically these metal stars that had, like razor sharp edges on them. And I guess the idea that they were a weapon, you can throw them at people and stab them to death or something. So we would take sheet metal discs, and there was a machine that would cut corners into sheet metal. So if we cut 5 corners, so that you had 5 points, and then you can grind down the points and make them super sharp, and you throw them as kung fu stars. And Mr. Lesovich was always on the lookout for those. And he would inevitably find us. He would catch us. He would take the star and he'd chop it up into a million pieces. And the other thing we had was at one point we were making. We used sheet metal a lot, so we were going to make these little boxes. And that meant bending the sheet metal into the right shapes, and there was 2 sides, and then there was a top that you had to kind of bend the flaps down, and at the end you had to solder it all together. And it was just this little box. And at some point somebody got the idea that this little box was the perfect size to hold marijuana joints. So we always called it the joint box. And we knew that drove Mr. Lesovich crazy. We'd say Mr. Lesovich, are we going to make a joint box today? And he'd get so mad. He'd be like, it's not a joint box. You put your bolts and your washers and your nuts in those. But we still did, oh, do you like my joint box? So anyway, again, the poor guy, what he went through, but we were kids, and I think he knew that. In terms of our bad behavior, I think one of the worst things we did was, every so often, Mr. Lesovich would have a movie, an instructional movie that he would show for us. And, this was way, way, way before the time when they had, computers and videos and monitors and that sort of thing. It was, you had basically a film projector. So he would wheel out the projector, we'd watch the film, and then he would always tell the same kid, Craig. He was a Greek kid, a hilarious kid, to, at the end, rewind the film so they could put it back in the original reel, and then he could put it away. But he would just kind of leave and go back to his office while Craig rewound the film. And inevitably, Craig would get it rewinding, and the take-up reel would go super fast. So it's going really fast because there's a lot of film. You got 40 minutes of film you have to wind onto this reel. It goes super fast. Craig would turn off, in the middle of this, turn off the take-up reel. So it would just immediately slow down. And then the feeder reel was still going 90 miles an hour. So the film would just shoot up 10 feet in the air. And as soon as it hit its apex, Craig would turn back on the feeder reel, and it would be all of a sudden the slack would come down, it would snap. And you'd see the film whop, 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 whop. And then it was Mr. Lesovich, the film broke. and he would come out and like get all angry, like how did that happen? And Craig would be like, I don't know, it was just going too fast or something, and he'd roll his eyes and put it away. He was going to send it off to the AV department to fix it. And the next day, same thing happened. Craig still pointed Craig. I don't know how many times this had to happen before Mr. Lesevich figured out, like, it wasn't just happening by accident. Craig was doing this. But I think to myself, like, I think we drove him nuts, but like I think he kind of got a kick out of it. He knew we were kids. I pictured him, at the end of a long day going home and, having dinner with his wife and just telling stories about these like idiot kids in his class and all the crazy stuff we would do. I mean, like, let me give you an example of why I thought he actually, underneath it all, he liked us. I remember we were in the classroom part and he was talking about some processy or something having to do with a metal shop, and somebody said to him, "Hey, Mr. Lesevich, what do you think the next big movie is going to be?" And he kind of stopped. He didn't get mad. He turned around. He walked up to the chalkboard. He picked up a piece of chalk. He didn't say anything. And I just remember him writing STA, and he wrote Star Wars. And at this point, I never heard of Star Wars. And then, as it turned out, it was this huge blockbuster, of course. They made a million sequels and everything else. But we talked about Star Wars, and he was so cool. Again, just a really good guy. So, that's my thought. Again, I guess maybe everybody looks back on their childhood very fondly, whatever era they were from. But the 70s really, it was just a great time, and I have such great memories. So that's it for today. If you want to hear more content like what you've heard today, if you enjoyed it, please do hit the subscribe button. I'd love for you to be part of my community. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.